Today, the Supreme Court deemed deporting people to Rwanda was not legal, and so put a stop to the government's inhumane migration policy. Now, in a way, it's a good and bad thing. It's good because people that would have been sent there are not going to be subject to possible torture or even be killed if they decide they want to protest like previous people, or the possibility of them actually getting shipped back to the country they fled from. However, it's also bad because if it had gone ahead, then the country would have been able to see that it was never going to work. The agreement was for about 200 people to go across at a cost of £170,000 per person, and we have to take some random refugees in return. So the whole thing was never a viable solution to the problem. It's just replacing one set of people with another. They were never consistent in their message either. On one hand, it had to be absolutely deplorable that nobody would want to go there. Yet on the other hand, they were trying to claim that it was the best thing since sliced bread for the people that were going to go there. Personally, I think this was the UK's version of Pearl Harbor, where they knew that it was going to fail, and there was just an excuse to bring us out the European Convention of Human Rights. Now they say they're going to replace it with the UK Bill of Rights, but that's just a nonsense. This is their opportunity to take away your rights to marry, your rights to have paid holidays from work, your rights to have sickness pay, your rights to a fair trial, or even have a right to a trial before there's any kind of punishment. This is what they want to take away from you, all under the guise of trying to tackle their so-called illegal migration. I mean, they could stop the boats overnight, just set up a processing centre in France, and then tackle the backlog of people waiting. Boom, problem solved. But just take a look at the people that have already said that it needs to take place. It's the same people that told you Brexit was a good idea. It's the same people that told you that things would get cheaper and we could have control of our borders or take back control. Within 10 minutes, the Weasel MP, Simon Clarke, was out doing the airways saying that we need to come out of the ECHR. And now the Prime Minister has said that he'll do whatever it takes, with his MPs cheering on an emergency legislation to take away your rights. It's an absolute joke, an absolute disgrace.
An unsustainable level of illegal immigration. And for my part, I think that the gauntlet is now being thrown down, and I think we are going to have to pass emergency legislation at a minimum to set out that the will of Parliament will apply, notwithstanding the ECHR and the associated conventions that the Justices referenced. But we may also need to consider, if that is not legally viable, withdrawal from the ECHR. Because let us be clear, replacing it with the British Bill of Rights does not mean that human rights don't apply in Britain anymore. What it does mean is that a convention which has clearly been extended in its interpretation far beyond what anyone in 1951 could remotely have considered plausible, let alone likely, needs to be constrained.
Of international obligations that the Supreme Court found against us on. So, the Commons will absolutely stand ready to pass that legislation, I'm sure, but there are a lot of questions to be asked about getting it through the Lords. But, the government has known this judgment is coming for months. We very much hope they've got worked up Plan B, and we're looking forward to hearing it.
When you talk about emergency legislation, are you talking about effectively finding a way to remove the UK from its obligations under things like the European Convention of Human Rights and the other bits of legislation the Supreme Court referred to this morning, like obligations on the protection for refugees?
So when the Illegal Migration Act was going through Parliament in the last session, we tabled amendments that would have enabled the plan to go ahead, notwithstanding obligations that lawyers and the courts might choose to invoke. The British country, I want to emphasise this, we are a fair and legal country. We are governed by law ourselves. We do not need the membership of international arrangements in order to make us an honourable and decent country. I think our common law tradition, our long-standing commitment to human rights and personal freedoms are sufficient and should be sufficient to ensure that our government behaves well and that we do not breach people's human rights. We do not need these international arrangements in order to be a decent country. And I really think the
Prime Minister has rightly said that he will do whatever it takes to stop the small boats and the evil trade around them. But isn't it apparent that after this morning's ruling, what it will take is a new law to override the Human Rights Act and to cut through the thicket of case law built up by judicial activism so that we can bring back control of our borders and stop the small boats?
Mr. Speaker, it's right that we go through the judgment carefully and properly, and as I said, the government has already been working in advance on a new treaty with Rwanda to address the concerns that have been raised, that were raised previously and that were raised by the Supreme Court, who also acknowledge that changes can be delivered to address those issues. But as I said, and I'll repeat, if it becomes clear that our domestic legal frameworks, or indeed international conventions, are still frustrating plans after that point, I am prepared to change our laws and revisit those international relationships, because we are absolutely committed to stopping the vote.